There we go. Now we got it. Okay, so we are finally back. Apologies for the long delays. I was sick, and then I was sick again, and then I was sick again, and then I was sick again, and then I was sick again. And how many times can you say I was sick? And then a little bit of a break. So we are back. Bag Musings, number 49. This is question number 49. So next time will be number 50. That will be a kind of big deal for us. But today's question is number 49. And our question for the day is, how do children experience faith? This is an interesting question. It's a good question. And as we always do, we'll get back into our routine, and we'll talk a little bit about the assumptions that that this question brings. I like this question because it is something that is kind of right down my alley in terms of what I studied in seminary. And I think, what we bring to this question and what the question itself brings to us is, first of all, we assume that children experience faith in a way that is not the same as for adults. And so then I think the next question that you ask after you kind of make that assumption is why? Why is that the case? And when I was in school, I took a class on this very topic. And the very first day of the class, the professor asked all of us to get out a piece of paper and to do some drawing for him. And so the first drawing he wanted us to draw, you were a child. And so I drew something that if I had any artistic talent whatsoever would have looked something like this. There's a big man sitting on a golden throne with a big white robe. He's humongous. He's looking down upon everything. That's what God looks like to child Katie. And then the professor asked us to draw, what does God look like? What did God look like when you were a teenager? And again, if I were a good artist, my picture would have looked something like this. This is my youth ministry couple from when I was a teenager in church in the youth ministry program. His name is Troy DeBruin, and he was a young man like most of the youth pastors were back then. And his wife, his brand new wife, Amy, was kind of part of the program too. And the two of them kind of represented for me as a teenager, who God is and what God looks like. God looks like those relationships that we have. And then the professor asked us to write down or to draw a picture of what God looks like to us now. And if I had been able to draw it properly, my picture would have looked something like this. The sun's rays kind of coming through the clouds so that you can see the rays of the sun coming down to the earth. And we were surprised in the class that the pictures that we drew were fairly similar. Obviously, nobody else in the room, had the same youth pastor as me. The pictures that we drew at the end weren't all of the sun's rays, but they were all fairly similar in that first picture was usually of some kind of distant, larger than life physical figure. Then the second one was usually some kind of relationship. And then the third one was a little bit more abstract, I guess, if you will. Not a picture of a human, but a picture of a concept of some kind. And so what we can assume from that and from other research, real research that has been done, is that children don't only experience faith differently from adults, they experience faith in a similar way to each other in terms of their developmental levels. And so we can say some things that I think that that science has pretty much solidified for us, that cognitive development and the capacity to understand is going to change as children grow. They're not going to, children are not just mini adults in terms of their mental and emotional and physical and spiritual and social abilities. We know that faith is always contextual. We know that faith has to do with our life experience. And so naturally, a child who has not had as many life experiences as an adult is going to experience faith differently. And we also understand that faith develops in stages. And because we also know that, generally speaking, there is kind of this similar experience from child to child, we know that these developmental stages are fairly static. Everybody goes through the same stages, and that they are progressive or successive. So every child goes through these same stages in approximately the same age levels in terms of when they transition to the next one. But the stages are hierarchical as well. You can't progress from one stage to the next without resolving the stages before it, without figuring out and mastering what comes before it. So this makes sense to us if we think about some concrete examples like math. We can't learn calculus until we've learned addition and multiplication and fractions and all of these different basics of math before we can get into the higher levels of math. We can't learn complex patterns of speech and sentence structure without knowing words, without knowing letters. We can't learn to read without understanding the sounds that the letters make. All of these things build on each other. And in the same way, our faith develops in a hierarchical way. So there have been several different theologians and psychologists who have studied faith in children over the course of time. And my favorite one is named James Fowler. Fowler wrote a book called Stages of Faith, pretty easy title. And Fowler says in this book that faith is a universal capacity of the human soul. And so faith is not just for Christians or not just for anyone of a particular religious faith, but he believes that all people have faith. What they have faith in differs, but their process of developing faith goes through the same stages and uses the same language, regardless of what the content is. And as children grow, they learn or pursue faith through the same stages as all other children do. So where Fowler got this, and I think it's really important for us to understand this background, is it started with Freud, Sigmund Freud, the famous psychologist, and his big thing was that all children go through this set of developmental stages in terms of their psychosexual development. And so we all know that, with Freud, it's always blaming the mother for all the problems that the person has. And, there's all this stuff about phallic imagery and Oedipus complexes and all these types of things. He was really into how our sexual development impacts who we are as adults. But for Freud, he kind of came up with this idea that children move through the stages and have to resolve the problem before they move on to another. The first stage when you're first born is the oral stage. Your obsession is with your mouth, because of course it is. You're hungry, you're trying to figure out how the world works, and so you put everything in your mouth. the most important thing that you do when you are an infant is eat. And so when you wean from the bottle and you start to eat, then you can move into the next stage, and only then. And so Freud said that all of his adult clients who are having problems of some sort are having issues because they're stuck on one of these stages or another. So for example, people who did not properly work through the oral stage are people who smoke, people who bite their fingernails, different things like that. And so he can pinpoint which of these tasks or which of these stages his particular client did not get through properly by looking at some of the symptoms that they're experiencing, like the fingernail biting and all those types of things. So nowadays, if people are chain smoking or biting their fingernails a lot, we might ask them about anxiety, because those are signs of anxiety for us. But for Freud, it's a sign that we did not properly complete the oral stage of our psychosexual development. And I don't tell you this because all this is very important, but this whole idea of stages and moving from one stage to another is foundational and was radically new at the time that Freud developed it. But what happened was, after Freud did this, he had a lot of different people that would study him and look at what he was doing and kind of come up with their own ideas. And so the next person that came along, who was a student of Freud, was called Erik Erikson. And he took this idea of the stages that develop, that have to come one after the other, and he applied it not just to psychosexual development, individual development, but to psychosocial development. So how do children grow socially was the question that he was asking. And he came up with this series of, and again, you have to move through all of them. You have to resolve each stage before you can move on. And what it's about at the end of the day is developing relationships and developing a sense of your self-worth and your meaning and your purpose in the world. So for Erikson, it's not just something that lasts through puberty like it was for Freud. It's something that actually lasts through your entire life. Erikson said that who we are is culturally shaped. And so over the course of our lifetime, the culture that we live in is going to help us to develop that sense of our identity. But everyone, regardless of where they live and in what culture, goes to these same stages at approximately the same time periods in our lives. He believes that the goal of human development is to form a personality that's vital and robust and flourishes. And so we have to master our environment. We have to have a unified personality. We have to develop an accurate understanding of who we are and what the world around us is all about. And that's how you kind of flourish as a human being. So Erikson calls each state a crisis instead of calling it, and he does use the word stage too, but he calls these crises. And you can see here, if you can read it, I know it's kind of small, that each crisis or each task is something versus something for him. So for example, in the very beginning, when you are first born, the first psychosocial crisis or task that you must complete is trust versus mistrust. Can you trust the others in your life? If you're developing socially, the first thing you have to do is figure out that something other than myself exists, and that other thing can be relied upon. I can trust it. And so what Erikson does is, for each one of these, he attaches a virtue, and hope is the virtue that goes with trust versus mistrust. Because if you are an infant who has absolutely no ability to take care of yourself, to even roll over, all you can do is cry. A crying baby is actually very hopeful. Someone is going to respond to me if I cry and say that I have a problem. But many babies learn very quickly that that's not the case. You go to an orphanage in China and it's silent. The babies don't cry there because they've learned that no one's coming, that they don't trust the outside world to take care of them in the way that babies that grow up, with attentive parents do. And so you can see that, obviously in the beginning, the way that a person addresses these developmental tasks is going to rely a lot on the people that are around them, because they're not, they're receiving outside input and then figuring out how the world works. But you can also see here that the way that children go through these psychosocial tasks are the building blocks for faith. You have to have a basic sense of trust in order to have religious faith, in order to have faith in something other than yourself, right? And so if a child develops trust in the first 18 months of life, then that virtue of hope and that ability to believe in something outside of yourself is established, and then from there faith can blossom. So does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Is this idea of the stages and all of this? So
Yes.
I can talk more about the Erikson stuff if you want. The Freud stuff I don't think is quite as important, although some of it connects, because obviously we're, as people, we are bodies, we are minds, we are spirits, we are hearts, everything is all interconnected, and we'll touch on a little bit of that. But what I want to do next is show you the kind of the charts, the stages that that Fowler brings up in terms of stages of faith that children go through. And then I'm going to talk to you about each one in turn and explain it a little bit more deeply. So here is a chart that expresses Fowler's stages of faith development. So we've done sexual development, we've done social development, now this is faith development. And you can see that unlike the others, Fowler actually has a stage 0. And like I said, you cannot develop faith without that initial trust. And so Fowler actually begins his journey from 0, because he believes that you have to get through that first stage of finding basic trust in order to actually start to develop faith. But that doesn't mean that it's unimportant. It is fundamental to planting those seeds of faith and spirituality in people. So by providing them with a safe and reliable environment, by responding to their needs, by showing them that the world is a place that is positive and engaging and engageable for them. So that first period of life isn't just important for the physical and social development of a child, it is fundamental for their ability to develop a positive and robust and meaningful faith life. For Fowler, faith involves knowing, valuing, and committing to something. So what we think and how we feel are both involved. So it's not just about a brain thing where we can get knowledge, but it's also not just about a feelings thing where we use our emotions to talk about faith. Faith is a combination of both of those things. And so all of our early life, in terms of our interactions with our primary caregivers, and then as we get a little bit bigger, our interactions with our environment, are all really important for how we move through this. But you can see here, well, probably not, because it's really small, but the stages for Fowler, just like the stages for Erikson, don't just go through until you become an adult, they go through your entire life. And so I'm going to focus most of my descriptions on the earlier ones, because our question today is about childhood faith. but I'm going to mention the other ones because I think it's important for understanding the earlier ones to think about kind of where are we going? What are we trying to achieve over the course of a lifetime? So I want to talk a little bit because Fowler is a Christian. Obviously, he's a person of faith, so he talks about stages of faith, but he is a Christian. And so he pulls some of the motivation, some of the background for his writing and thinking about this and the stages that he developed from the Bible. So before I jump into describing all of these different stages, I want to point out some of the passages that he pulls out. He believes that religious developmental stages are a process. Obviously, there's movement and growth in your faith, and you have to engage in this in order to be formed for faith throughout your life, in order to be incorporated into a community that involves faith similar to your own, and then also to prepare yourself for your vocation, for what you're going to do with your life. Not necessarily your career, but sometimes your vocation and your career match, but sometimes your vocation is other things like being a parent or being a volunteer or something like that. So he thinks that all of these things are essential, and he believes this. He finds the proof in the Bible, so to speak, from a couple of different places. So the first place that he brings up is Ephesians chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. He said that which says, we must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knitted together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth and building itself up in love. And so that's a whole lot of words because that's our friend Paul. But basically what it's trying to say to us is that, there's a difference between being a child and being an adult. So the Bible, is aware of this. The people who lived in the ancient world, who were engaging in asking these questions about God and ourselves and who we are in relationship to God, understood that to be a child is different than to be an adult, that you grow up, you are able to stop being blown about by winds of doctrine and trickery and craftiness of other people. You can become more firm in your faith and more accurate in the way that you describe your faith, so that you grow up in every way, it says, into what? Into Christ. You have a goal. And so Christ ultimately for Fowler is the goal of these developmental stages, to grow up every way into Christ, is where we're headed with this. But he's got a couple of other places that he pulls from the Bible, including Hebrews chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, say, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the basic elements of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is unskilled in the word of righteousness. But solid food is for the mature, for those whose faculties have been trained by practice to distinguish good from evil. So this passage tells Fowler that not only are children and adults different, not only do we develop from children into adults, but that there is a sense that we have these basic things that we need to get, and sometimes we don't. And so then we have to, we are stunted in our faith development. We have to work out, like I said with Erickson, we have to work out the crisis of the first stage before we can move on to the next stage. And how do we do this? Well, we teach each other. So older people who are more mature, help the ones that are younger. So these are some of the things that he pulls from this particular passage. And then finally, he pulls out from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. So again, this sense of development, of growth, of change that has to happen, not just in our physical lives and our social lives, but also in our spiritual lives and our faith lives. So ultimately, Fowler says that faith is about knowing, valuing, and committing to something. What that something is, of course, for us as Christians, is Christ. And so that is the ultimate goal. So any questions up to that point before I start hopping into some of these individual stages?
Well,
good.
From experience, what happened with our son more than our daughter is the pastor we had at our church had his doctorate in theology. And his problem is that he didn't know how to deal with kids. So when it came to confirmation class and all of that, my son said that Daddy's talking over our heads. He says, we ask him a question and all he does is repeat what he said. Is that he couldn't break it down into their stage, learning in life. Is that, and sometimes during the majority of his sermons, like Barb and I both said, it was too much. Didn't understand it, his interpretation of it. And so I think that's got a lot to do with development of the child in their faith and in life.
Yeah. That's kind of where I'm headed with this class, because this week's question is, how do children experience faith? But I think, kind of more importantly, how do we as adults, understanding how children experience faith, how do we engage with them where they are? How do we help them along the way, right? And so understanding these stages, understanding where a child is going to be, or approximately where a child is going to be based on their age and what we know of them, will really help us to be able to walk alongside them and to speak a language that they understand, right? Cognitively and spiritually. So let's jump into talking about some of these stages a little bit and kind of what they look like. So like I said, there's a stage 0 for Fowler. And this is from the earliest days. This is approximately ages 0 to 2. So in the first 2 years of life, like I said, you start out with that development of basic trust. You have a caregiver who is going to respond to your needs, to your cries, or not. Do you have? Can you plant the seeds of trust and courage and hope and love through your interactions with your surroundings in those earliest days, or not? And those are essential for the beginning of the development of faith.
What was that?
Cindy. So, but within each of these stages, they're like with Erickson, there is a positive side, but there's also a danger side. And with stage 0, even there is the possibility that as you are developing the basic trust, you're crying out for your caregiver to feed you or to change your diaper or to fulfill whatever need you have, you can easily develop excessive narcissism. Everything is about me, and you never start to develop a sense of the other. So that's one danger. But then there's another danger of isolation. If you're not getting enough attention from the caregiver, if your surroundings are not responding to you, then you start to feel alone. You start to feel isolated from everything around you. And then as you move forward, you are unable to develop faith, because if you don't have some sense that something outside of yourself is positive and that you want to be in relationship with something outside of yourself, whether it's because you think too much of yourself or you think too little of your surroundings, then you're not going to be able to move forward. And so, so this stage, even though it's not even a stage yet, it's stage 0, this stage has to be resolved with the development of basic trust, or you cannot enter into even the first stage of faith. Each one of the stages has a trigger, usually, that triggers a child or an adult as you get into the higher ones, that makes you ready to move on to the next thing. So after you have established that basic trust with your environment, with your relationships around you, then as language starts to develop so that you can think about something, but then you can express it, then you are finally ready to step into the next stage. You've developed that trust, you want to communicate, and now you can. And so now you can actually start the process of developing faith. So then we jump into stage 1. So stage 1 of Fowler's stages of faith is called the intuitive projective kind of faith. And this lasts from approximately ages 2 to 5. This is obviously an estimate, and not everybody waits that long to start it, and not everybody lasts this long. Some start a little bit earlier into the next stage. But when you're working with a child, if they are approximately age 2 to 5, and you see some of these things happening, then you will know that this is where you are with that child. So this faith is highly based on imitation and fantasy. It is uninhibited by logic. There is a lot of fluidity and thought patterns. There's no need in the mind of the child at this point or consistency in the way that they apply things. This is a toddler and a preschooler that we're talking about here. And you can think about how that plays itself out in the secular world. Anyone who interacts with 3 and 4-year-olds knows that they're into pretend play. They're into imitating the adults around them and what it is that they are doing. They're into imagination. Imagination is the next completely necessary step toward the development of faith. First, it's some kind of basic trust and hope, and the next important and required item is imagination. Faith requires a moral imagination. In order to have faith in something outside of yourself, you have to be able to imagine possibilities. You have to be able to look into something that is not right in front of you, right? I mean, we talk about faith as an opposite of logic or concrete fact, because faith is about something that is not right in front of you, and so you have to have some kind of imagination. But there is a danger in imagination, because imagination can become overactive and it can take over. And when that happens, depending on what the content of that imagination is, you can either end up with images of terror that frighten the child into suppressing imagination, or images that are so compelling beyond what's reality that they start to fixate on what can't be, rather than using their imagination to think about what might be or what could be. And so these are the dangers of this particular stage. And then at the end of this stage, as a child prepares to jump into the next stage, start to develop concrete operational thinking. So instead of having kind of a loosey-goosey understanding of how the world works and how their own minds work, they are able to connect an idea with the purpose of that idea, an image with the function of that image, an object with the function of that object, and they work together to create a deeper and more concrete understanding of that thing or idea or object or whatever it is that we're talking about here. So that's how you kind of jump into the next stage. So I'll stop there after 2 and see if there are any questions. Hi, Cindy. Good to see you. So any questions or comments so far? All right. So we've got basic trust is developed. We've got the potential for imagination is developed. And now we're going to jump into what is called mythic literal faith, stage 2. And this is for children who are in the elementary ages 6 through approximately 12 or so. In this stage, meaning, purpose is bound up in stories, in the myths of a community, in the symbols of a community. Symbols are literal and symbols are one-dimensional. I think it's so not funny, not haha funny, but funny, like ironic, funny, weird, that so many pastors out there love to use object lessons to teach children during the children's message, because kids do not understand when somebody holds up, a marker and says, Jesus is like this marker, because this marker can, write the word of God on your heart or something. Like, they just don't get that at all. And so then they go home and they say, Mommy, Pastor told me that God is a writing utensil. Like, they are incapable of making those kinds of metaphors work. They're very literal. And so it is the worst possible way to engage with a child. And it's so very popular, or at least it has been. I haven't been, around other pastors and youth workers in large numbers for a long time. So maybe they've all kind of given up on it. But when I was in school, it was very popular. And I just thought it was really interesting that would, that's what people try to do, because the adults get it, they love that. But the kids, it just totally goes over their heads, because at this stage, everything's literal. Symbols can't have multiple meanings. At this stage, the world is about reciprocity. Give me and I'll give you. It's about fairness. That's not fair. That's not fair. It's about how we behave, following the rules or not following the rules. The way that children in this stage imagine God is primarily through the image of a person, so anthropomorphized God, within stories. So the way that a child engages the world is through stories. And you read with children at this age, you tell them a lot of stories. In the church, we've always spent this time teaching the kids the basic stories of our faith about Noah and Abraham and Moses and Jesus. Learning those stories is what starts to kind of seep faith into them. And as we talked about before, the word myth is not used in the negative sense that it sometimes has been used in. Myth doesn't mean against fact or the opposite of fact. Myth means story that explains why something is, or gives something meaning or purpose. And so what children at this age are able to do is not only receive these stories and have these stories start to kind of sink into their bones, but also to tell their own stories, to give meaning to their experiences through stories, through drama, through mythologizing of themselves even, that starts to develop. But there are some dangers, again, with this level, because children are so caught up in reciprocity and fairness and literalism, and rule following, and their identities are wrapped up in their behavior. They can fall into one side or the other with works righteousness or badness, is what Fowler calls them. Works righteousness, as you know, is a familiar term in the church. And for children in this stage, they can get caught up in that drive to be good, that drive to achieve something. And this fits really well if you go back and you look at some of the other stages of other types of development. So if you look at the Erikson that I explained just a little bit to you, this is the same stage, the same period of development, in which children are developing either a sense of self-worth, of purpose, of meaning for their lives, or they feel extreme guilt. Are they going to be able to produce? Or are they going to be able to achieve something? Or are they going to be worth nothing? And so that kind of falls into their faith lives as well. Am I going to be a good kid? Am I going to earn my way into, what's the word I'm looking for? Into accepting and into deserving, I guess is the word I'm looking for, God's love and all these different elements that we talk about in terms of the church, or am I just so bad? Am I going to give myself into badness? We become cynical. We give up on the attempt to be good because our behavior can't match with what it is that we know we ought to do, in terms of that very literal and concrete faith. And so those are some of the dangers in this particular stage that we have to look out for, and help kids to understand that their worth as a human is not laid just on their ability to be something, to be good or be bad, or whatever it is. That we all do good and we all do bad things all the time, and who we are as Christians is bound up in God, and that's something that can't change, which is something that kids can't necessarily understand at this point, but it provides them some comfort, and I think it helps to move the process and the stages of faith along. So again, as you kind of start to get toward the end of this stage, there is another trigger, which is the increasing dissonance between stories. When a story is telling a particular story, is sharing a particular message, but then there is another story that kind of is sharing a different message that conflicts with the other story, then children can't really necessarily bring those conflicting stories together, and so they start to notice that more and more, and the conceptual thinking capacity starts to develop. And so as they start to develop toward their prefrontal cortex and toward more abstract thinking, they start to then develop into the next stage of faith, which is called synthetic conventional faith. This stage is the first stage that can be final for someone. For the most part, obviously, there are going to be people who have developmental disabilities and things like that would probably get stuck in earlier stages of faith development. But this one, 40% of adults don't move beyond stage 3. So stage 3 tends to set on with puberty and move through into adulthood, and sometimes can stop and last for the rest of the life of that person in 40% of the cases. This stage is called synthetic conventional faith. Conventional because 40% of people hold on to this faith. Within this love stage, what's really important is mirroring. What you need is for people to act as mirrors, to reflect back their experiences and self-images to the person that is developing. So teenagers need you as an adult to mirror them back to themselves so that they can perceive who they are, so that they can develop their identity. They are criticizing those who fall short of their ideals, including themselves, and they're looking for influences outside of their families, so that they can find more and more of those mirrors, somebody who's worthy of mirroring back who I am and hopefully who I want to be. And so there is a sense that we as adults are there to provide that mirror rather than to provide the content as it was in earlier stages of faith. At this point, we're being asked to reflect back the experiences that the children are having, and they desperately want to conform to societal conventions and to what expectations are placed upon them, but they're struggling to figure out what those expectations are. And so when it comes to faith development, God often becomes the ultimate mirror to reflect who you are and who you want to be back to you. Because when you interact with another human, you have the pesky truth that human is also a person for themselves in and of themselves. But when it comes to the concept of God and faith in God, God is a little bit more abstract a concept. God isn't, a physical presence necessarily. And so God can, in some ways, become what you want God to be. And so teenagers have this hunger for acceptance and for confirmation of who they are, and having others know them deeply and accept them anyway, not just in spite of, but because of who they are. And so that is the God that they are looking for. That is the faith that they need. And they need something that is going to serve as kind of a guarantor of who they are, and that idea, that identity, that existence of the self is held somewhere with some, with this God that has the power to maintain that. And so that there's a sense of security within identity that is starting to develop. There is an understanding that who I am is bound up in the narrative of my life. And so at this stage, we start to develop personal myths, the narrative that I tell about who I am. When I was a teenager, I loved to tell certain stories that I had heard about my younger life from my parents, or that I had remembered, because those expressed who I wanted to be or who I thought I was at that time. But then there were other stories about myself that I didn't tell because those are not part of my myth. Those are not part of who I want to be. And so the way that we express ourselves is through these stories, and being able to choose for the first time in our lives which stories we tell, and therefore what our identity is, what our direction is, what the meaning is for our lives. And so we start to develop these stories about ourselves, including our system of faith, what it is that we believe. Our ability to articulate that grows. We are able to defend the content of our faith. We're able to emotionally invest in the system of our faith that we've developed through this personal myth. But what we cannot yet do is is take the system and reflect on it objectively. Say, here are the stories that I'm telling about myself. What does that mean? Why am I choosing this story and not this story? We don't have that ability when we're in this stage of faith. And I think I got this in the wrong order, so I'll put them all up. So we're developing this myth for ourselves and this narrative of our life that helps us to understand our own identity and our own purpose, but we're unable to examine that story and think about deeply what it means and whether it's accurate or not, and things like that. According to Fowler, there are several dangers at this point, and any one of you who has ever interacted with a teenager, which I know is all of you, will know that this is a very fraught time of life. So you won't be surprised to know that there are several dangers that we can talk about when it comes to developing the faith life of a teenager. One of them is called, Fowler calls compensatory intimacy. Because we rely so much as teenagers on others to mirror back who we are so that we can develop our identity and look for that self-image in others. If human relationships fail to provide us with that mirror, then we can tend to over-identify in our relationship with God, because God is so much better at being a mirror, because we can kind of control God or our concept of God better than we can control our concept of others. It's so easy for a friend or for a parent or for a mentor to do something or say something that shatters what we believe to be who they are and their relationship to us. But it's much harder for God to do that to us. And so we as teenagers might over-identify with God as the be all end all, which of course is, but there are God works through our relationships with humans, and so we have to grapple with the truth that the other humans in our lives are not just there to mirror back who we are. They are there to be humans themselves and to wrestle with who they are and to wrestle with who God is for them and for all of us as a community, and do all the same things that I'm doing as a teenager. So that's one of the potential dangers for this stage. Another one is called the tyranny of the they. Because authority is located externally, who I am is defined by the mirroring that I get back. The way that I should behave is defined by my desperate need and desire to conform to what the world is doing. And so authority is placed externally in a radical way during this period. I want to be accepted. I want to belong. And when that happens, it's really easy for the individual to feel like they've lost control over their own lives, to feel like they've lost control over their decision making. The old, well, if Jimmy jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? Kind of question that you get. Well, of course I wouldn't jump off the bridge, except if Jimmy did it, I might consider it because I just that desperately want to fit in. So that's, I didn't think about the fact that smoking is bad for me and that you would be really angry with me, Mom. I just did it because everybody else was doing it, and that was my priority in the moment, was to find belonging, to find who I am in the presence of other people. And this all makes sense when you think about who came before Fowler, again, when we go back to Erickson, because this is the period in psychosocial development where we are thinking about our identity. Who am I? And do I have my own identity, or do I just kind of collapse myself into others? And if I can develop and come out of that stage with a sense of who I am, differentiated from, but in relationship with others, then I have successfully completed that stage. So same thing, if I can be in a relationship with God and with others within my faith that is neither distanced so that I have to, turn God into this ideal of what I want my relationships to be, but also not so tyrannical that I lose my sense of who I am, then we have successfully moved our way through this particular stage, and we're able to step toward the next stage, which, like I said, not everyone does. Oh, there we go. So if you do transition out of stage 3 into stage 4, the reason that happens is because you start to expand your exposure to people with different ideas and different backgrounds and different experiences. And so the dissonance between the messages that you're receiving from various trusted sources of authority start to crack through and make you realize that, for example, you grow up in a church and your church tells you all these things about who God is and who you are. And then you go off to college and you get a professor who tells you something completely different. And all of a sudden, your world is just blowing up, because what do? Do I believe this person or do I believe this person? This is precisely what happened to me when I went off to college. I ran into Professor Buzz Myers, that I've talked about many times in this class, who intentionally would put cracks in our face so that we could start to learn how to examine it. Because at this point, we aren't able to examine it. Like I said, we've got this personal myth. We can defend it. We can articulate what it is. We can invest who we are into it. But what we are unable to do is examine it. And as you age and as you actually, develop the ability to examine, but you don't, because you have placed so much of your life narrative, your personal myth into these stories, who you are, the meaning of your life is placed into these stories and into these myths and into these, what you believe to be truths. And so the older you get, the harder it is for you to give into that dissonance. And so the more you're going to fight against it. So as you age and as you kind of, double and triple down into this myth that you've created for yourself, it becomes harder and harder to start asking those questions, to notice and to accept the fact that you've got these conflicting messages coming in. And so then you get really good at finding excuses for why you don't have to let your whole world explode over this, because this is XYZ. I can dismiss this authority on these grounds, or I can dismiss what this person is saying because they are illogical here. And so you can't allow yourself to start to examine yourself and get kind of underneath and around and above that personal myth, because you have so much invested in it. And so that's why so many adults kind of stop here. The majority of the people who stop here don't leave home. They stay in the same place, same community, so that you never experience other types of authority figures that might offer something else. They tend, in terms of faith development, they tend to be more in the conservative denominations. When we're looking at mainline churches like Lutherans and Presbyterians and United Methodists, the majority of those people move beyond this stage into the next stage. But this is the last stage for childhood specifically. So from here, I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit, because we're trying to just talk about kids, but I did want to let you know kind of where this is all headed. So I'll stop there for a second and let you ask questions or make comments if you have any.
So in regards to brain development, then you're saying some adults don't move past this stage?
Yes, that's correct.
And so they look at everything through this particular lens. They're not open to other ways to see things.
Correct.
Okay. Well, I believe in lifelong learning, and I think that when people stop learning, they stop growing and developing and being who they are. So I would really, how do you deal with somebody that's in that stage?
Well, Karen, from all these years that we've been doing this together, I can tell you that there are several people in your life who are these people. So you tell me.
You're talking about my brother-in-law.
we all have these people in our lives, right? We all have people, and sometimes the dissonance even within themselves is so jarring that you can hardly believe that they're able to hold it together without physically breaking apart. There are people that I know who will not ask a question about their faith because it would just shatter everything in their lives. And so they will do anything before they will ask a question about their faith, but they'll ask questions about everything else. And they just have this little, sequestered corner of their lives that is the church and God and their faith. And we do not open up that Pandora's box. We can talk about anything else you want, but we don't talk about that. We have to sequester that because that's precious. That will result in too much turmoil in my life. And the more somebody holds on to that, the tighter they have to continue to hold, and the more dissonance there is, and the sadder their life gets, because all they have to do is let go, open up. It's a really hard time here going through it, but once you get through it, life is so much richer and fuller and meaningful. But it's you can't convince somebody to do it; they have to do it on their own. But that's why so many younger people, go through this, because they don't have so much to hold on to in terms of buy-in to these systems of personal mythology and conformity. That once you kind of start coming into yourself, you can say, okay, well, I did this whole conformity thing and I figured out who I am, and now I don't need you anymore. I don't need you to mirror back to me because I know who I am. And I'm ready to take the next step and start to not just know who I am, but analyze who I am and figure out if that's really who I want to be, or if I, need to make some adjustments. But not everybody can do that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right. We ready to move on to stage 4? This is my favorite stage.
Yes.
All right. So stage 4 is called individuative reflective faith. In this stage, we have gone through this whole thing where we've developed our identity. I've developed our idea about who God is because somebody has told us, and we've established it, and we agree, and we conform to everybody that's around us. And all of a sudden, something happens that triggers us to realize that what we always believed isn't quite as simple as all of that. This usually happens as young people are entering into emerging adulthood and move through adulthood for a lot of people. So this is where about 60% of adults land. So we had about 60% make it to this point. We had 40% that stayed behind. We've got about 60% that make it to this point. And then we'll have a few more that make it beyond this. But what we do here is we get hypercritical. We start to tear apart everything. We filter our experiences of other people so that we can decide if we're going to accept them or we're going to judge them. And how they treat us, of course, is going to have a lot to do with that. We develop the ability to control and manage our brain functions to meet our needs and understand how those different needs fit together and how we can behave in such a way that we can meet all of those complex needs all together at the same time. We are using second level thinking at this point. We're thinking about the way we think and criticizing it. Am I thinking about this idea properly? Can I think about the way I think more and figure this out in a better way? We understand other people in terms of where they fit into the systems that we are analyzing. Are you one of those annoying people who's stuck in stage 3 and you're so immature and I can't believe that you aren't where I am, understanding and able to criticize everything that's going on around you? You uncritical, unexamined people, I feel bad for you, but I also, disdain you because you're not as smart as I am. So this is the period that's called the second narcissism, believing that we have, these great abilities, this great intellect that is beyond what anyone else could possibly have. We open up our symbols, we break them in half so that we can interrogate them and come up with new interpretations constantly. You can tell why this is my favorite stage. This is what I do. I love to do this. We are working so hard to tear everything apart. We're being postmodern. Everything is up for grabs. Nothing is sacred in this stage. But what happens in this stage eventually is you realize that if nothing is certain and everything is up for grabs, then my own examination abilities, my own investigative tendencies also need to be criticized and torn apart and figured out. Maybe I'm not quite as good at this as I thought I was, because I have to think about the way that I'm thinking about thinking. It kind of, it kind of starts to spiral outward to a ridiculous degree. And when this starts to happen, this is where you transition out of this stage. So kind of what happens is you get to stage 3 and you develop this, conventional faith that is based in the personal myth, and you've synthesized the stories of your life with the stories of your faith, and you've developed this sense of identity for yourself. And then some people stay there while others move forward and say, I'm on the right side here. I've got this all figured out. I know what's going on. I'm ripping everything apart and criticizing it, and you can't do that. And so I'm going to make fun of you, but you're going to be angry with me because I'm trying to hurt you. I'm trying to tear apart your faith. I'm trying to tear apart your sense of self. And so stages 3 and 4 are constantly at crossroads with one another. They're constantly butting heads with one another because stage 3 just wants to stay where they are and maintain and protect what it is that they've built. Stage 4 wants to just destroy everything and burn it all to the ground just for the sake of burning it all to the ground. So then we jump into stage 5. Stage 5 is called conjunctive faith because this is where we see stages 3 and 4 come together. In stage 5, yes, in stage 5, start to realize that there is truth to be found in the contradictions and paradoxes of life. That we don't need to fear the paradoxes like stage 3 does, but we also don't need to find the paradoxes and believe them to be the end of the conversation as stage 4 does. You can hold ideas in tension, and multiple things can be true at the same time in different ways and for different reasons. And then we start to see an interest not just in the self and in developing of our own identity and our own sense of purpose and our own understanding of the world, like earlier stages, but we actually have interest in providing space for other people to find meaning and to grow. People who reach conjunctive faith early in life are often teachers and pastors and other people like that. Only about 10% of the population makes it to stage 5, but the representation of stage 5 people of faith is much higher in places like seminaries and churches that value education and logic, like Lutheran churches and Presbyterian churches, because people are kind of forced into that stage 4, and then they work their way toward that kind of crisis moment where they realize that if they're going to tear everything apart, they've got to tear themselves apart, and then they start to kind of calm down and move into this stage 5 where they start to reconcile. So 10% overall, but much higher percentage appearing in more intellectually based churches like our own. Let's see, what else do we have over here? There is, like I said, there's this sense of supporting other people's journeys and helping to guide them through. So it's no longer like in stage 4, the interactions with stage 3 people was to goad them, to poke them, to embarrass them. Now, interactions with people in both stages 3 and 4 is for the purpose of encouraging people forward, helping them to grow and to find meaning for themselves. And this makes sense because we reach in again, going back to Erickson, at this stage, this kind of falls in line with what he calls the generativity phase, where we are looking to be productive in life, and not just for ourselves, but in relationship to others, finding that way for what we do to have meaning beyond ourselves. And so it makes sense that in this stage of faith development, we would be looking to find meaning in terms of our faith beyond ourselves. The idea of that we want to hold on to meaning, we want to hold on to our beliefs, we want to hold on to those stories that we had disparaged and criticized so much in stage 4, but we don't want to hold on to them so tightly that we constrict possibilities. We are willing to loosen up our grip a little bit and engage something from a new direction, a new dimension, a new perspective, because we understand that the thing itself and the way that we have engaged in the past is not the point. The point is the growth. The point is the engagement. The point is the movement. And so that is that's what stage 5 faith is all about. And just as an aside, I would say that everyone in this Bible study is stage 5 faith, because otherwise you would either be yelling at me or you would refuse to go with me toward the conclusions that I draw. And I've never had anybody yell at me yet. So that's where I think we are. So there is one more stage after this that none of us have reached at this point. The trigger for this is unknown. And Fowler says this because it is so incredibly rare that there are no patterns to look for. And so here's what the final stage looks like. And again, I'm only telling you these things because I think they're important when we're thinking about child development, which is the point of today's conversation. We want to think about what is the end goal. Stage 6 is not really the end goal because not very many people get there, if any, and I'm going to express that to you too here. But as Christian faith development, stage 6 is basically, Christ-likeness. He calls it universalizing faith. People who have reached stage 6 are people who have a genuine focus and an inner vision of what human life can look like. They are ultimately committed to the thriving of all humanity. They are the people who bring action to the communities so that we can develop this inclusive and fulfilled human community that looks beyond the structures of different religions and allows us to see that all cultures share universal truth and all humans are worthy of compassion and understanding. And so when we think about, this, obviously very few people reach this stage. But I think there are some contradictions in even how we would assign who has reached this stage. For example, Fowler himself points out Gandhi and Mother Teresa as two people who reached stage 6 faith. But now, years later, we know that neither of these people were actually, the wonderful, perfect people that we thought they were. They did some pretty horrendous things, in the opinion of the general population, that they would have argued was in the service of their universalizing faith, but it was completely inappropriate behavior for somebody who claimed to be, this kind of central spiritual figure. So ultimately, I think, and this is Katie now, this is no longer Fowler, I think that there really isn't such a thing as someone who has reached stage 6 faith fully. I think we can try. I think we can work toward this kind of faith. I think we can have moments of clarity where maybe we live into this fully for a second, but I don't think we as humans, because we are sinful and because we are not fully who God created us to be at this point, because of that, I don't know that you can reach a stage 6. Another example that Fowler gives is Leo Tolstoy, who is not somebody who has been canceled with this whole cancel culture thing like Mother Teresa and Gandhi sort of have been. And his whole shtick toward the end of his life was equality and giving more than you consume and living a life of asceticism, having compassion for everyone. But he was ostracized by his community by the end of his life. The things that he was writing were things that people didn't want to hear. They didn't want to be criticized. They didn't want to be told that they were living selfishly and not supporting one another, because they know that, we all know those things, but nobody wants to be told those things. But that's ultimately for Fowler, where faith is headed for everyone. And how we describe that as Christians is to say that, stage 6 is being like Christ, right? To ultimately fulfill that calling to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, which we all know we can't fully do. So, questions, comments about this process of faith development, particularly in light of what we're trying to talk about here, which is children's faith.
Wow. It's a lot to think about.
Yes, it's a lot. It's a really great book. It's just called Stages of Faith by James Fowler. So if you're interested, if you're a reader, you could pick up a copy off of Amazon or something. All right, so we're getting late here. I will look it up. Moving on to kind of coming back around to our question: how do children experience faith? And I think through Fowler and through even Erikson and Freud, neither of whom were people who spoke from a Christian perspective. All of the various types of development are tied together and support one another and impact one another. So physical development of children, social development of children, emotional development of children, academic development of children, all of these impact faith formation and what faith means for that individual child. So I think that's really important to remember. I think when we're thinking about children and the way that their faith develops, we have to think too about the wider community and the way that we as society are developing. I think that the process of growing up is in some ways the same process we humans are engaged in as a group, as a body together. We're asking questions about identity, we're discovering meaning and purpose for ourselves. Isn't this exactly what what the church is doing? What we as the community of faith are constantly asking, who are we? Why are we? Right now, our congregation is asking these questions. Why are we here? What is our purpose? And this is what individual faith development is about, and this is what communal faith development is about. So I think we can learn a lot from from this process in terms of how we can apply that to our corporate body, our corporate selves within the church. And then when we ask the question, how do children experience faith? I think what I'm more interested in, or maybe the question behind the question, is how do we as adults help the faith of children to flourish? And I was thinking about that as I was putting this lesson together, and I think that questions are really important for children. Asking questions, looking for information, looking for those stories, trying on things, imitating, all of those things are really critical to development of all kinds for children, and especially their faith. And so encouraging questions, but not dictating answers, not allowing children to kind of set themselves up to get stuck in stage 3, where they can't ask any more questions, where they can't continue to process forward, I think is really an important thing. Providing support for the other types of development. If we want our children to grow in their faith, they also have to grow in all of the other ways. We have to provide them with that trust and love that they need from the very beginning. We have to expose them to the stories and symbols of our faith so that they can move through that period where the stories and development of personal myth are so important, so that those faith stories can become part of their story of who they are. We can help them to develop and find a firm foundation, but not encourage them to make that foundation into something that is unquestionable and unmoving for the rest of their lives. To encourage them to aim toward that stage 5 faith, where they can hold on to their beliefs and their faith, but not so hard that it squeezes out and becomes fleeting and no longer gives life to them. I think we can be aware of all the different pitfalls like that we talked about, the dangers, so that we can encourage children away from them. Some of the early Erickson crises have to do with internalized shame, internalized guilt, and I think that adults do a really good job of encouraging that, frankly, in their children. When we're constantly picking on kids and what they're doing wrong, we are encouraging them to resolve, so to speak, that crisis in their developmental lives in a negative and harmful way. Whereas if we help to show them ways to move beyond the experiences that they're having and the behaviors that they're having and the cognitive limitations that they're experiencing, then they can move forward in a more positive way. When we dictate identity limits for our children that are at that point where they're developing their identity, we I think are setting them up for failure, or for them to kind of get stuck in a particular place in their faith lives. So being aware of those dangers and those pitfalls allows us to watch out for the subtle ways in which we help that along in a negative way, and allow us to shift and be more supportive toward positive movement, which I think is really important. And I think it's important for us to remember that children can teach us and remind us of who we are and who God is. And so this is probably going to seem a little a little, what's the word I'm looking for now? I've been having such a hard time with words since I was sick. Just all the good words have flitted out of my brain. But anyway, this is the passage that I've chosen for us to wrap up with for today. This is from Mark chapter 10. It says, "Let the little children come to me," Jesus speaking. "Do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." And so I think in light of what we've discovered about Fowler, this passage is reminding us that our faith is wrapped up in our identity, and our identity is wrapped up in our faith. And so these things are right next to each other, but that it's important for us to ask questions and not assume that we have all the answers, and to keep the focus on what's important. What is essential and what is not is going to change in our estimation over time. But I think that what ultimately is essential is not what we tend to spend a lot of time arguing about when it comes to faith. I think we tend to spend a lot of time arguing about things that are not essential. And so to enjoy that, I love arguing. I love getting into debates about silly little things, but to remember what's important at the end of the day is something I think that we can learn from our children and hopefully mirror back to them so that they can continue to develop in that way too. So that's what I've got for this week. Any final thoughts, questions, comments?
Yeah, I had one, now I lost it.
You have to do a better job of interrupting me when these ideas come to you, Karen.
Well, I was just thinking about, the teenage growth years when they're the people that they're looking to for answers and help and stuff, let them down when they don't, or they reveal themselves with hypocrisy. You do this, but you say this, and kids look through that right away, and they don't like it, and they don't want to follow it. Mm-hmm. And I think that having role models and people interacting with them at that age is just critical. But
mm-hmm.
You don't see a lot of things like that going on, and I don't know, it seems like the kids get more involved with television shows and movies than they do with actual people.
Well, it's really hard to be that person in that situation, because the expectation is that you are that mirror, right, at that age,
right,
at that stage. And so what is desired is that you be perfect, that you meet the ideals of that person, of that teenager, but that you mirror back to them who they are, and who they desire to be. But as an adult in their life, that what they really need is someone to guide them forward, to help to gently, point out to them their flaws, and to admit your own flaws. And they're really good at pointing out flaws in other people, and it's hard. It's hard to have the humility to accept that, to not get defensive, to not dismiss, and to say, yeah, I want to be a person of integrity, and the criticism that you are that you're sharing with me is legitimate, but know that it's really you're gonna have to tread very lightly and not be as blunt as them. There's not a whole lot of reciprocity in those relationships.
Right.
And so it's hard, and I think
it is hard.
I think that's why so many teenagers end up having their relationships limited in such a way to their peers and to their televisions and their phones, because people who try end up just burning out so quickly, and it's so difficult to maintain that over the long haul. But I know there are even some people on this very call who are willing to put up with that and and
Yeah.
find the silver lining and the calm after the storm.
Well, I just thought of my question. It has to do with children looking for something to make meaning of their life, especially as they get to be teenagers. And they get caught up in these movements, or, what I would call cults almost, but these philosophical ideas that just take over their life. I don't know. Does that make any sense? I'm wondering what causes that to happen, even to kids who grow up in the church and have a strong home life, get caught up into that.
I think it's that combination of the mirroring, because what is reflected back to them from people like that is different than what they are sending out, but that they don't realize that. And I think that conformity, that deep desire to belong and to fit in, is so strong within the identity development that it's really easy to kind of fall into what everybody else is doing, and whatever the trend is, whether it's in terms of fashion or in terms of philosophy or in terms of what you place your faith in. And of course, the desire to develop my own identity means that I have to start criticizing and rejecting the identities that I have just uncritically accepted previously, to ensure that it's my identity and I'm not just mirroring my parents' identity and becoming my parent, which is the worst thing in the whole world. And so we have to reject that. We have to push back on that and find new possibilities to try on, new identities to try on. And when we find a group that all has agreed that this is the identity that we're going to wear, then it's really easy to fall into becoming, just taking on the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are these stages, and I'm really sorry, I've been in and out and everything tonight, but are these stages linear or are they fluid? By that, I mean, can someone experience something in their life that will knock them down a couple of these stages for a period of time until they right themselves? Or is it just once they've passed a stage, they've passed that stage?
No. So how these stages work is Fowler follows Erik Erikson, follows Sigmund Freud, and so it's each stage is consecutive and each stage is hierarchical. They build on each other, and so you can age, physically past when a particular stage should have been resolved without resolving it properly, and then that's where you start to get various types of disease, within your whatever the topic is. So when we're talking about Fowler, if your faith is malformed in some way, what Fowler would say is that you have to follow back in the life development of this person and figure out in which one of these stages they got held up. And I would say that when you get stuck in stage 3, it's the same thing. You've gotten held up. It's just that so many people get held up there that it kind of becomes accepted to get stuck there, and it's not considered to be a problem as much as it is in earlier stages. Anything else?
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for sticking with me. We started really late today, Cindy, because my internet has been awful with all the storms and everything. So we started really late. So I apologize for keeping you so late. So next week, we will talk about the question, why do we celebrate Jesus' birthday in December? And like I said in my email, I do have Pastor Janet Chapman from the first Christian Disciples of Christ. I'm trying to line her up to come and speak to us about animals because that was one of our questions. And she actually just finished a sabbatical last summer on that very topic. And so I would love for her to come and speak with us. So all of these future topics are currently tentative based on when she can come and talk to us. But for now, next week, we'll talk about why Jesus' birthday is celebrated in December. And then once I hear from her and we get her on the calendar, then I can give you the whole schedule moving forward, and we'll keep on chugging along with our mixed bag musings. Sound good?
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Good
All
night,
right,
all.
Thank
thanks,
you.
everybody. It's good to see you all. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.